All right. Well, greetings, everybody, and welcome to this session for the mEducation Alliance. My name is Mark Lynd. I'm presenting with Carol De Silva. We'll introduce ourselves in a second. The session is called Monitoring and Evaluation of EdTech Programming. How do we know it's working? And Tony Bloom had asked us to think about presenting in this symposium because we've done a bunch of work with him in the past on various projects, including All Children Reading 2. So a lot of our examples in this presentation will be drawn from our experiences on that. Anyway, welcome. Glad to have you here. Again, my name is Mark Lynd. I'm with School to School, and I'm the president and co-founder and also technical advisor on a lot of our M&E programs. And Carol?
Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is Carol De Silva. I am the Senior Director of Impact and Learning at School to School, and I work with our evaluation and research team and also provide technical leadership in literacy and some other areas. So I'm really looking forward to talking with you all today.
Yeah, and we're eager to learn about all of you as well. We'll be doing a brief poll in a couple slides. If we have a small group, maybe we can actually even go around, but let's see what how that goes. This presentation is an hour long. It's intended to be interactive, so please feel free to interrupt us with questions or examples or, hey, wait a minute, what do you think about this kind of ideas? We're starting with introductions, a brief poll, and then a brief overview of EdTech research. What do we know about various EdTech interventions? And then we're going to share with you 6 lessons that we've learned in assisting groups doing monitoring evaluation with EdTech interventions around the world. Finally, we're going to have a small group discussion period where we're going to ask you for some of your ideas as well, and then a brief exit poll. And just to give you a brief overview of who we are, School to School International, for any of you who have not heard of us, has been around since 2002. And we work all around the world, as you can see from this map. We're committed to improving the lives and learning of girls and boys around the world through research, practice, and partnership. That's our URL there if you want to get some more information. And now for the poll. All right. Are you all able to see the poll?
Yeah.
Should I expand it here? Is that how it works?
No, I think, yeah, everyone should have the participant entrance poll that popped up on their screen.
Okay.
Yeah. If you don't, please let us know. I see there's some answers coming in.
Yeah, I'm not able to see it on my screen.
I'll summarize it for us all. I'll just give everyone another few seconds to finish answering.
Terrific.
All right, so it looks like, I'm going to go ahead and summarize. It looks like we've got primarily in terms of the capacity in the sector of the folks who are attending. It looks like most people come from the NGO sector, although we do have a couple of private sector and an other. In terms of how many years have you been working in EdTech, 0 to 3 years, about 40%, so 4 out of the 10 who are responding. Another 30% in the 4 to 9 years, and we have 3 people who have worked in this field for 10 years or more. So we're pretty evenly distributed across those timeframes. Are you currently implementing an EdTech intervention? Half are currently implementing an EdTech intervention, and the other half have not, or are not, but at least a couple have in the past. And then what ages do you work with? Basically, it's primary education overwhelmingly, with a little bit of youth workforce development. And then what skills do you target with your work? Also, unsurprisingly, the bulk of the respondents are focusing on literacy in the work that they're doing. And then what strategies have you worked on? This is interesting. So we've got, folks who've worked with radio, TV, computers, mobile phones, tablets, which is the overwhelming percentage. 9 out of 10 have worked with tablets. And then we also have internet access, some apps, that's also 80%, 8 out of 10 have worked on apps, and then an other. So that gives us a little perspective on kind of the expertise everyone is bringing to this conversation, which I think bodes well for our small group discussions later. So I'll end the poll. All right, those are the results.
Terrific. Oh, very good. Okay.
Okay. And we'll close that. All right.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Let's move. All right, I'm going to jump in here and give us a little bit of an introduction on EdTech. Obviously, you all have a lot of experience in this, so we won't belabor this too much, but I want to make sure that everyone is kind of on the same page. So, so this slide, we're focusing on sort of what are we talking about when we're talking about EdTech. And we use a lovely definition from our fearless leader, Tony Bloom here, which comes from a USAID how-to document. And in this conversation, we're using the term EdTech and ICT kind of, synonymously. So, and we're really using it to focus on, the examples that you all just described in the poll, which is what are the tools that you're using to employ to improve educational outcomes. So it could be everything from computers to the internet to, broadcasting technologies, telephone technologies, and so on. And we've also shared here an overview of the skills, which you all focused on primarily literacy, and that's unsurprising given the kind of larger donor context that's focusing on foundational learning. And you'll see here in this 2019 study that was done by the Brookings Institution, literacy was also a big focus of EdTech interventions. But there are other things as well, including, citizenship, vocational skills, other academic subjects. And I think, what we find is that you can really apply educational technology to learning almost any skill. And one of the benefits of educational technology is that, and we've learned this, of course, from COVID, is that it helps us to have a broader reach in terms of these educational skills. So, we know that children learn both inside and outside school, and technology is a way for reaching them outside of school. In addition to reaching them, it also could offer an opportunity for more sort of time on task, which we always struggle with on all of our educational programming in schools. So there are some benefits to applying it to the different skills, but also sort of the external component moving beyond schools, not just in schools. Next slide. So we wanted to give just a sample of different EdTech programs. This is a graphic that was taken from one of our kind of evaluation studies working with the All Children Reading Programming. This is just an example. Obviously, there are many, many kinds of EdTech programs out there, and they address a wide variety of issues. So, they might address parental engagement, for example, as the Your Child Reading and You program did. It might address, inclusion and reaching children with learning disabilities, like the Reading Beyond Sight program does. And then, some of the broader themes of why we're using EdTech programming is, it can help improve individualized learning and assessment. It can support play-based learning through apps and games. It can also offer content in different modalities that will help to reach children who have different abilities. And that might be, from the inclusive education perspective. So there are a lot of different types of EdTech programming out there. And this is just a small sample. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay. Then we wanted to talk just briefly about, so when should we use it, right? Because we don't want to use it, just for the sake of using it, right? EdTech has to have a purpose and it has to be appropriate for the context. And I think, again, that's something that really came out during the pandemic, was we weren't really necessarily prepared to use all of these sort of EdTech tools that we might have at our disposal. Because the sort of enabling environment for the use of those tools was not there. So this is a sample framework that we can use when we're thinking about, okay, we want to evaluate this EdTech project. What are the things that we have to take into consideration when we're planning our evaluation? Obviously, these are things that have to be taken into consideration first before launching the implementation of the intervention, but also really important to take into consideration as possible barriers to the effectiveness of that intervention when we're doing an evaluation, right? So thinking about, to what extent is the teacher's comfort a potential barrier or sort of a predictor variable of the eventual effectiveness of that particular program, and thinking about how to incorporate that into our evaluation of these projects. Okay, next slide. Another example is just the importance of kind of documenting and understanding what the digital context is more broadly. So in addition to more sort of qualitative questions like, what's the level of teacher's comfort? It's sort of like the nuts and bolts of, how many mobile phones are out there? What's the level of penetration? How many households have radio, TV, etc.? And these are factors that we need to take into consideration when we're thinking about the potential impact of an intervention, an EdTech intervention. And it helps really orient us to what's likely to be the most effective kind of modality for reaching those populations. And it helps to, again, identify, barriers that might predict the effectiveness of the outcome. So next slide. So why are we talking about evaluation? Why do we care about knowing what works? Well, what we realize, obviously, is that despite all the progress that we've made in terms of, being more rigorous in our evaluations of educational programming, just generally, there is a lot of evidence that, these EdTech interventions may be implemented without real data behind them, right? So obviously, we're all very we're all very interested in what's the impact, but we also have to have evidence to be able to make decisions about what's most cost effective as well. And to not have any information about the impact of an EdTech intervention, which may be more expensive than more traditional interventions, is really to our detriment. So the reason that we're having this conversation is because we want to encourage rigorous evaluation of these EdTech interventions so we can really make the best decisions for children and their learning. All right, I think that's it for our little introduction, and I will now turn it over to Mark.
Thanks, Carol. Yes, we're going to share with you some lessons we've learned from working with organizations who have asked us school to school to be their partner in monitoring, evaluation, and learning over the years. And again, we'll be drawing principally from our work with All Children Reading, because there were some interesting lessons coming out of that experience, but also from other examples around the world. Our work with All Children Reading, as you might know, All Children Reading is a grand challenge, they call it. They award prizes or amounts of money to grantees around the world. They're now in their third round. This was in the second round from 2014 to 2018, when 11 grantees were awarded grants of up to about $300,000 to implement an EdTech project to increase literacy amongst children at early ages in 8 countries around the world. So we served as their monitoring and evaluation partner to all these grantees, help them with their theories of change, results frameworks, gathering monitoring evaluation data, and also in all the projects conducted pre-test, post-test of literacy gains using an adapted EGRA tool. So from all that experience and others in other projects around the world, we had a few things we'd like to share with you. And again, please feel free to drop in the chat or raise your hand if you have a question, or in addition to any of these lessons, or want some more clarification. Well, there will also be a chance to discuss more at the end. Our first lesson is to determine the stage of your intervention. Well, what do we mean by that? This might have been the biggest lesson coming out of ACR2, working with the partners, USAID, World Vision, and DFAT, because all 11 projects were evaluated as if they were at the proof of concept stage, even though for you EdTech people that have implemented these projects know that, as Carol was saying, even before trying to establish proof of concept, we want to pilot the intervention, and even before that, do an assessment of the context so we know that it's a reasonable type of intervention for that context. Anyway, when we're rolling out an EdTech intervention, we do want to have a moment to pilot it and really answer this question: can this work in this context? Which has its own monitoring, evaluation, and learning considerations. You know, is it easy to use? Are there any technical problems with it in this context? Do users like it? Is it a reasonable cost? Just to settle these questions before it moves to the proof of concept stage. The 11 projects that were financed by All Children Leading for the second round all did have kind of proof of concept MEL frameworks, but in retrospect, it became clear to the funders that even though they wanted data on whether children were learning, in fact, many of the interventions probably would have been better served with more of a pilot stage type MEL design. We can talk more about that for anybody who is interested, but these really do require different ways of thinking about whether our interventions are working. And then, of course, even with ACR2, one of the questions was scaling. Do we have enough reason to believe that this concept, if it has been proven, is going to go to scale? And so there were also some scaling questions with ACR2, which, again, in some instances were warranted, but in many, the interventions were still being explored. Our second lesson was, again, this is a concept related to MEL programs in general, not just EdTech, but also EdTech in its own particular way. And that is, when we're setting up our MEL design, we really do need to think about what phase of the project we're in, because there's this whole phase even before the project, as Carol was talking about, with the framework from site of things that are important to ask with EdTech interventions before we decide whether to launch and how to launch. And then at project startup, there's a whole set of questions that a MEL team is going to want to look at in terms of, even if we've done an assessment saying that this is going to work out, is it really going to work out in this context? Let's try it. Let's do it some things on a smaller scale before we actually ramp up to everybody in this project. And then during the project, when it's going full steam, then a full MEL program, including a results framework and all the tools, et cetera, fidelity of implementation, is really the appropriate time to do that. And then finally, at the end of the project is when impact evaluation and performance evaluations come in. When we have evaluated these or worked with these programs to assist them with their MEL systems, generally, the paradigm is phases 2 and 3, that the project has a MEL framework, that there are indicators that are being reported to, and then in the end, we're going to have to demonstrate impact of some sort. Again, one of the examples in one case, we had a project that we just dove right into the second phase of rolling out the project, and then realized that it was actually designed to deliver literacy instruction using smartphones. But in going into the communities where the project was working, they did a quick survey and realized that most of the kids really only had feature phones, which the app wasn't designed to work on. So they had to make a quick decision and quickly provide smartphones to all their communities in order for this application to work. So again, kind of an error of knowing where to jump in and when to actually start your intervention. A third lesson, and again, this is something that happens across MEL projects, not just EdTech, and it's been happening much more acutely during this time of COVID, is to think about what the limits are of what we can measure. And what do we mean by that? Typically, EdTech projects look at 4 or more dimensions of whether an EdTech intervention is working. First, they'll look at reach. Are our programs actually reaching our intended audiences, whether it's a phone app or getting materials out to communities, whatever it is. Secondly, they'll look at dosage, even if our interventions, our radio programs, for example, are reaching the audience. Are they reaching the audience in the intended amount? If they're supposed to go out 3 times a week, are they being broadcast 3 times a week? And are they actually being received 3 times a week? A third dimension looked at, it typically is nature of participation. So even if the radio programs are being received, are the audiences actually playing their intended roles? Often the children are expected to be listening to a radio program, for example, but in the presence of a caregiver or a tutor or somebody that's helping them learn to read or follow the directions, is that actually happening? And then finally, again, we're always being pushed to document whether we're making a difference in terms of learning, which is reasonable. So the outcome question, are beneficiaries exhibiting the intended outcomes? In the case of a reading program, are children actually able to read better? So knowing which things we can measure in these projects has become trickier in the time of COVID. Most of the research that we've been part of looks at the first couple dimensions. Are we actually reaching our audiences, and is it the required dosage? The other ones, nature of participation and outcomes, tend to be a little more difficult to, first of all, obtain information for, and second of all, to be sure that we're getting a reliable read. Even the first two, we don't know if all the children were reaching in a survey to assess the reach, for example. We can only reach the children, for example, that have phones, or the families that have phones. That's just one example. But if we actually want to also measure whether our radio programs are helping children read better, that becomes even more difficult. In one example of a radio program in the Congo that was rolled out recently during the time of COVID, this became particularly visible because the questions of reach and dosage were pretty clear that the programs were going out, that children were listening. But nature of participation, when the implementer would ask, are your parents around when the programs are happening? Often they couldn't get an answer, or learned that the parents were in the field actually while the children were at home. So it was very difficult to get a picture of whether that assisting relationship that the parent or guardian should have was actually even happening. And then measuring outcomes was even trickier. Are the children learning to read? Some questions were based on remembering vocabulary words, but this, of course, could be something that the child knew even before the radio program started, and there was no baseline for that. And of course, the most important thing, measuring comprehension, is difficult, if not impossible, to do at a distance, because we can't control the text that's in a child's hand, whether that child's actually reading or somebody else is. If it's done at a distance, it's very difficult to measure. So again, when setting up a MEL program for EdTech interventions, to be realistic about what kinds of things we can measure in order to set up a program that is going to give us reliable information. Our fourth lesson has to do with the type of information that we are looking for. because in most MEL programs, as you all know who have been associated with monitoring evaluation in these programs, the main purpose tends to be for accountability. That is that we need to report usually to a funder based on whether indicators have been met, the indicators stemming from the results framework or theory of change or contract or whatever. And this is natural. Of course, a funder wants to know if the things they're paying for are happening. But as you know, over the years, that idea has evolved. And so M&E has become MEL, for example. So monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So there is now a second purpose to most MEL programs, including that learning piece, which it should lead to not just reporting, but increased understanding and adapting. Some of you are familiar with the USAID's model of collaboration, learning, and adaptation, which builds on this principle that it's not just about reporting to indicators, it's also about learning as we go and adapting so that we can actually get better outcomes rather than waiting till the end. So from a learning perspective, the main question, rather than achieving our indicators, is, are we achieving our aims? Are we actually meeting our terms of the theory of change, for example, the thing that we're trying to get to? Are the strategies that we chose really the best ones? Slightly different questions from meeting our indicators. And then finally, a third purpose that funders are also often very interested in is persuading other people that if this intervention is working, how do we persuade other people to adopt this intervention? It's a type of marketing or communications kind of agenda, so that we can think about how to share this information with a wider audience. One of the biggest mistakes that we've seen groups making, and we try to help plan for these different things, is that the group will say, yes, we're going to do the accountability part of MEL, but we're also going to do the learning and persuading part, all three equally well. But what we've learned is that even just doing the accountability part of monitoring and evaluation is actually quite hard. Most groups we work with around the world, smaller NGOs, even mid-sized projects, often don't have a full MEL staff, where they're allocated to other things, often lack certain critical skills, whether it's around analysis or types of reporting. And so even getting the accountability piece done can be really a challenge. And so if they're also adding a learning or persuading agenda to their MEL plan, then really our lesson is that these groups need to think about what skills do we need to make these things happen, what resources, and really, is this all going to happen in this project? One project we were associated with, helping with CLA, again in the Congo, just one round of doing CLA sessions involved going to all the 6 regions and hosting regional consultations, coming up with conclusions that were then fed to the national level and another consultation at that level. And that was just one cycle. So to think about the costs involved, skills that are needed to present that information, what to do with decisions at each level is really not a small matter. And these things need to be taken into account if people are going to embrace these ways of doing MEL. Our 5th lesson, plan your work and work your plan. The famous tennis player Andre Agassi would say this over and over, his famous comeback in the tennis world. It seems very simple. It seems like, of course, everyone knows that. Of course, we all try to do that. Harder to actually pull it off in real life. One thing we've discovered working with many of our groups around the world is to be really clear about their implementation plan. For example, do they know what their objectives are? Do they know what their targets are? Do they know what their deadlines are? Surprisingly, people have often general ideas of these, but have not taken the time to really map out how it's actually going to happen. What's the objective? What's the activity? How will we know if we've succeeded? Making sure the plan gets carried out. We had one partner we were working with in one country with ACR, where there were going to be computers in community libraries that the project had developed software for. And the software would help a child coming into the library sit down at the computer, see a list of things the child could read, And then based on that child's reading ability, the child would choose one of those leveled readers, read it, and then come back and take a brief quiz on the computer. The computer would then tell the child what their level was and therefore what the next list of books to choose from was. It was really a nice idea. And this was rolled out in, I think, 10 libraries. But over the course of that project, just carrying out their implementation plan, making sure that the children were sitting at the computers, were actually accessing the programs, were actually understanding what their instructions were, was often beyond this project. We asked multiple times afterwards whether this had happened, and they had no data on how many children had come in, whether they'd gone past the first page, what choices they made, et cetera. So this example and others around the world really taught us an important lesson about how MEL takes place. And that is that in the cases where it worked the best, where organizations were really able to lead their MEL programs competently, roll out their interventions the way they planned them, and then also communicate the results to a wider audience. What did they have in common? What we found was they had these three roles being played: a project manager, a MEL lead, and a content expert. Maybe that was three people, maybe it was more. Actually, two roles or three could be combined in one, although that would be a big lift, but it's possible. But without any of these three actors, if any of those was not present or not able to do their job fully, the program really suffered in terms of its ability to get the MEL work done or to get the message out. One example was when we were working with a literacy project in Eastern Africa. They had a competent project manager, a competent MEL lead, but nobody that knew how to understand or interpret EGRA results. So they implemented an early grade reading assessment because they were asked to, and they carried it out very competently, had a good sample and did reliable administration and produced all the results, but then didn't really know what the results meant. And without a content expert, somebody who was a reading expert on staff and somebody who knew what these different statistics meant for reading, they really had no idea how to write the report or how to talk about to other people about whether the program was a success or not. This is one of many examples of how these three roles are so critical in making sure MEL happens properly. Now, our final lesson we're going to share with you has to do with looking beyond measurement of outcomes. This is something that we learned again with All Children Reading, particularly in the case of designing assessments for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. We had a couple projects where we were working with programs that had assistive technologies where children would look at an interpreter, so somebody signing on a computer screen, or other means, visual print materials that were used to drawings of children with showing different signs to help them understand how to read. And then using those things, we created an EGRA to measure pre-test, post-test, whether children in fact were learning to read in the early grades. One of the big challenges that anybody working with children who are deaf and hard of hearing is aware of, that we became aware of, is that it's not just a matter of our children learning to read, even if it means through signing so that they can communicate back what they're understanding. But when they arrive at school, do they even speak a language that they can read? Because in many contexts, there is no standardized sign introduced in a country or in a region. And so parents will often raise their children who are deaf or hard of hearing, communicating with them very successfully through gesticulation, through pointing, et cetera. But it's not a standardized language that the child can then go to the school and use with other children. So arriving at the school, often children actually need to start learning the local language in sign before they can even start to learn to read, much less be assessed. All of which is to say there are huge hurdles in assessing children, particularly special populations, that need to be considered when we're working with these groups. The EdTech part is just one part, but then how do we actually measure what they're learning? But the other lesson that we learned in the case of Morocco, which had a very successful signing program, and again, children did make gains, although not huge, was that the ministry, seeing this project, really took note and started developing policies around inclusion, developed an inclusive education unit within the Ministry of Education, and again, is inspired by this work as well as others around the country, changed its thinking around how to deal with children with special needs. So again, as an evaluator of an EdTech program, to remember to look beyond what just the exact impact of whether it's increasing reading ability or using an app. Those are important metrics, but not the only ones. So that's a lot of information, but we wanted to at least give you a chance to kind of look into some of the experiences we've had and have a chance to think about, from your perspective, whether you've had any of these experiences as well as sharing back with us some of your experiences.
Great. So thank you for that, Mark. That's been a really great overview. And I think now what we'd like to do is hear from you. We're going to break into some small groups. Looks like we have around 15, between 15 and 17 participants, depending on how we count them. And so I think if we could break into groups, maybe 4 groups, that would have, three or 4 people per group, and we'll talk for about, let's see, maybe 3 minutes, and then after that we can come back together. We'd like to ask each group to nominate one person who could maybe report out on the content of the conversation, and specifically we're interested in hearing your reflections on what Mark has presented, but also to share with us any lessons that you've learned, given the breadth of experience of the participants. So with that, let me just check. I see there was a question in the chat. Could you quickly show slide with lesson number 3 again? Could we go back to that just quickly? Mark, do you want to remind us of what this slide is about?
Sure, and I'm curious to know what our participant is asking as well. But the gist is that there is a kind of a continuum of types of questions that typically we want to ask with an EdTech intervention, from reach to dosage to whether the various audiences are participating the way we intend to outcomes. We improved reading, improved numeracy skills, whatever that is. And that depending on the context, particularly in this time of COVID, if we're going to get that information remotely, as particularly on the right side of the continuum, knowing about who's helping the children learn, for example, or whether the children are learning and how much, can be particularly problematic. Finding these things out on a mobile phone or by other remote means is simply, in some instances, either not possible or it's so unreliable that it becomes questionable whether it's worth even trying to get that information, at least initially. So that was the gist of the slide.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark, for reminding us all of that. Okay, so we'll head back to the slide with the instructions for the small groups, but just as a reminder, we'd like you to talk about your lessons learned. Please choose someone to report out. You'll have about 3 minutes or so for discussion, and then we'll come back together as a large group. So you should receive an invitation to join a breakout group on your screen very shortly, and we'll see you back in a few minutes.
And Carol, I wonder if we could drop the PowerPoint into the chat for people to have access to as well.
I will see if I can do that.
Perfect, thank you.
Carol, Mark, thank you so much. I was just going to say, I've been getting some messages that individuals wanted your PowerPoint. So I was going to ask if we could share it, like we can send it out afterwards or whatever's the easiest.
Sure, sure.
Linda, Stephen, you still here?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. How are you guys doing?
Good.
Yeah.
How are you?
Doing all right. I think I need an IV of coffee. No, it's always fun. Definitely keeps you moving. But it'll be nice when it's over.
Yeah. And this is the last one for today, right?
Yes, this is the last session for today. So this was our light day, and definitely have some busy days ahead. But it was kind of nice. We kind of tested the waters with a bunch of different things, and at least it was a smaller group, just the Lynd's members and things along that line. So Kim and I are going to circle back and kind of make some adjustments. So if you guys have any suggestions of anything you guys saw, I don't even have my video on. You're just listening to me. If there's any suggestions you guys have on your back end or anything like that, just let us know what we can do to like kind of change some of the logistics. And Linda, again, want to just say thank you for all the Zoom related stuff. You've been a saving grace in that capacity. I'm just going to go back in and just kind of adjust the Zoom links and kind of spread it out across the licenses.
Yeah.
So that way there's not back-to-back sessions on the same license. And then I'll readjust the Zoom links everywhere they're listed.
Yeah.
It's all good. I'll pair up with Kim and we'll figure it out.
Okay.
So we'll loop you in if there's anything we need from you, but I have your login now and then I'll use Kim's as well.
I think so. We have about like 1 minute. So I'll send out a broadcast. Still don't know.
Are you rotating them a couple times or?
No.
Yeah, 3 minutes.
Okay. Apparently in the other session, Zola was the session technician and she lost capabilities
Link.
to her screen and audio and everything. So at least Kim was in there and she was able to join. Yep. Always gonna happen. I can't wait for in-person meetings again.
Next year.
Yes. So our ultimate goal was to do it this year, and we wanted to do it because we've always done it in DC. We were going to do it abroad. Our hope was to do it in Rwanda. That's what our thoughts were. So next year, our hope is that we could do it somewhere in country because then it's more accessible to others to participate and everything along that line.
Yeah. Not as many technical glitches and all that to worry about.
Yes.
Okay, we can close them now, I think.
Okay. Yeah. And the free food and just hanging out with people.
Yes, yeah. I think just going from session to session and that in-between time is nice.
Yeah, no. I know. Should have factored that in, but oh well. Here we are.
Oh, for the physical ones, I mean.
Yeah.
It looks like people are slowly coming back.
Yeah, I think they got a countdown, so maybe some of them are wrapping up their conversations.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I don't think I was able to put the PowerPoint into the chat, so I hope that didn't interrupt too much everyone's conversations.
Yeah.
Once I got transported to the breakout room, I couldn't do that anymore. So, but we are happy, I think, right, Mark, to share the PowerPoint afterwards as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Great. So I don't know exactly who was assigned to each group, but I hope that the groups were able to nominate someone who'd be willing to speak. It looks like we only have about 5 minutes left, so it'll be a quick discussion. But I would like to invite, someone to volunteer to be our first reporter and share any of the lessons learned that you discussed.
I'm happy to go. I was with Mark and Drew, so they've already presented, so I'm happy to go quickly. My name is Barty. I'm with Save the Children Australia, and we were just talking about the importance of, in the world of infobesity of data in learning analytics, making sure that you're presenting meaningful data, and the challenge of balancing what a marketing team might see as exciting data versus impact data, and trying to find a balance between the two, and benchmarking potentially being something that is more effective, and finding that balance.
Excellent, great. And yeah, I mean, I think that this idea of presenting meaningful data and planning in advance for your audience is super important. And actually, this is something that Mark and I talked about when we were preparing for this presentation, is how when you're talking about education technology, the way in which you communicate it and the way in which you present the data is really important, because we all have different sort of depths of digital literacy, right? Our understanding of these interventions might vary depending on the audience. So that's, I think, a really important point that you've identified, Barty. Thank you for that. All right. Another group want to share one of the lessons that you talked about?
I think we're all muted by default.
Oh, really?
Unless we unmute, yeah.
All right. Are people still muted?
Well, we're waiting for people to unmute. I'm going to stick in a shameless plug. I stuck in a link in the chat to our paper toward learning at scale in developing countries, lessons from the Global Learning XPRIZE field study, which boiled down to studies in developing countries are much different than in places that we're used to, and how what we did about it.
Great. Thank you, Jack, for sharing that resource.
Yeah, you can just paste in from the chat.
All right, will do. And Jack, were you in a group?
Yeah, but Dana, I nominated Dana to be the to represent us.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Jack nominated me at the last second. So I will just say that we're so excited to meet one another and chat about our different projects. That's what we spend the time doing, as opposed to MEL situations. So there, just goes to show you, MEL doesn't always work because you're so excited to talk to people.
Dana, just to clarify, I nominated you. I didn't dominate you. That's what it sounded like.
There's a fine line there, Jack.
Sure. Sure. Well, thank you for that. And I'm glad that you just had a chance to network and connect with one another. That's one of the important functions of these sessions as well. So no worries there. Any other group that would like to share a lesson? Or if you don't want to share a lesson, maybe share a reflection on what Mark has presented. So I will add that, I was in a small group with Erin, And Aaron and I were talking about a very interesting project that he is working on, which is to launch a literacy app in, I believe, 28 different languages. So, you know, one of the things that we were talking about, and Aaron, feel free to jump in here if I get this wrong, but one of the things we were talking about was just how complicated it would be to even understand some of that more basic information that we presented in the introduction, like cell phone penetration among that specific population, right, of you know, that linguistic population. But in 28 different linguistic populations all across the world. So even though it seems like just kind of one question and one indicator, but given maybe the remote nature of certain language groups, or you know, given the variation in their connection to technology, you know, even just gathering that information to then understand, you know, how that might be a barrier to take up of this app would be quite a study, a very interesting study, but you know, quite a study. Aaron, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, I just say, yeah, exactly. Like, even if we had just the most amazing national level data for a particular language community that maybe only has 12,000 speakers or 400,000 speakers, it could look radically different. Who has smartphones? Who has feature phones? Those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. All right, I do see that we're at time, so I won't keep soliciting input for our lessons learned, but we certainly hope that this has been an interesting conversation for all of you. It's been a quick conversation. We'll make sure to share the PowerPoint afterwards. We are going to ask you to do a brief exit poll before you leave, so don't leave your screen just yet. And Mark, did you want to end with anything?
No, just to thank all of you for joining. I wish we'd had more time to hear your stories and lessons over the years. Hopefully we'll have a chance to meet again, maybe in another session in the symposium, and continue the conversation. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think the lesson is we needed more time.
Always.
Yes, and the mEducation Alliance is happy to take any feedback as well. So we'll factor that into our planning process.
Right.
Well, nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet everybody. Thank you.
See y'all tomorrow.